story opens in the ordinary rhythm of a city at work, the kind of noise that makes people ignore the details beneath their feet. In the summer of 2024, a crew contracted by the city was assigned to replace a length of buckled sidewalk along a quiet stretch of road. It was the type of repair that draws little attention. Orange cones, the smell of dust and wet cement, the low grumble of machines. Residents walked past without more than a glance, assuming it was routine maintenance. But when the jackhammers cut through the top layer and the first slab was pried loose, a worker spotted something that made him pause. It wasn't rubble nor rebar, but the delicate glint of beads, dirt-stained and tangled, still arranged in the shape of a rosary. The men initially thought it was a coincidence, a piece of religious jewelry dropped and somehow preserved. Yet when the foreman knelt down and brushed aside the dust, the beads were still threaded through a clasped hand. A pale fragment of bone, curled as if holding on to prayer, lay sealed beneath concrete that city records insisted had not been touched since the 1970s. The work halted immediately. The street suddenly transformed into a scene of quiet disbelief. Within an hour, the police had cordoned off the block, and word began to ripple through the neighborhood. For older residents, the site stirred a memory they had tried not to revisit. Two young women in habits who vanished without a trace on their walk home one October evening in 1994. They were twins, inseparable since childhood, known for their devotion to their parish and for the way they linked arms when crossing the street. Their disappearance had once shaken the community, but as years stretched into decades, the case was quietly folded into the official narrative of a voluntary departure. Two nuns overcome by pressure, leaving the order and slipping away. Families were encouraged to accept it. The convent was told to remain silent, and the city went on. Yet now, 30 years later, the unearthed hand pressed against a rosary forced that narrative to fracture. The location of the find made no sense. The section of sidewalk where the discovery occurred lay along the exact route the sisters were known to take from their convent to a nearby parish house. The concreting records claimed the slabs had been untouched for decades, before the twins even entered the order. The contradiction was stark. How could remains tied unmistakably to them be sealed beneath a surface supposedly older than their disappearance? Investigators arrived with cameras and measuring tools, their movements deliberate, careful not to disturb the site more than necessary. The beads were bagged, the bone fragments lifted gently, each piece photographed against the gray backdrop of broken pavement. Witnesses described the atmosphere as hushed, almost reverent, as if a kind of burial had been disrupted. For the first time in 30 years, the case had tangible evidence, proof that the sisters' fate had not been self-chosen, but inflicted. Local reporters gathered at the edge of the tape, their questions clipped short by official statements. No comment until the coroner's report. All possibilities remain under review, but residents whispered their own conclusions. For years there had been quiet unease about the way the story was handled in 1994, the speed with which it was closed, the absence of any follow-up. Now those doubts felt justified. The discovery of the rosary was not only a clue, it was a rebuke to the institutions that had insisted on silence. That night, news of the find spread quickly online. Archived photos of the twins resurfaced. Two smiling young women, identical features softened by their habits, hands clasped in prayer. Their faces, once fading into obscurity, reappeared on screens across the country. The city that had half forgotten them was forced to remember. The story that began with two missing sisters was about to reopen, with a very different question. Who poured the concrete, and why did they want the truth buried beneath it? The convent had always been a place of routine, bells, prayers, chores carried out with quiet obedience. But in the archives room, where rows of wooden filing cabinets lined the walls, the rhythm of devotion left behind something else entirely. The archivist, a woman who had been part of the order since the early 1980s, remembered the twins not only as sisters in Christ, but as two young women with fragile laughter and a stubborn streak that often surprised others. When the sidewalk discovery reignited the case, she unlocked a drawer she had not touched in 3 decades. Inside were letters written in a familiar looping script, carefully folded and addressed not outward to the world but inward, to their Mother Superior. These were not the official letters placed in convent records for posterity. These were personal notes, written on thin stationery, creased from handling, sometimes blotted with what looked like tears. The first began innocently enough, speaking of the October chill, of candles burning low in the chapel, of the comfort of shared prayer. But woven through the daily details was a tremor of unease. One line read, "We are faithful, but we feel eyes upon us when we walk home. Not all eyes belong to those who seek God." The later letters were more urgent. In one, dated just 3 days before the sisters vanished, they described being stopped at the corner near St. Bridget's crosswalk by a man in uniform who questioned them about their route. They wrote that he laughed when they refused a ride, calling them girls playing at being holy. That line had been underlined twice, as though one sister emphasized it to the other before the letter was handed over. Another note, crumpled and difficult to read, mentioned an argument with city workers repairing a lamppost along their path home. They should not have been there that late, the letter said. When we asked who sent them, one looked away. Mother Superior never shared these letters with authorities at the time. Instead, she folded them carefully and kept them in her private files. Her silence became another layer of the mystery. Perhaps she feared damaging the convent's reputation, or perhaps she simply did not trust that anyone outside would believe the twins. Fears. In 1994, the police were quick to insist there was no evidence of foul play, suggesting otherwise might have invited ridicule or worse. Now, 30 years later, these fragile pages spoke louder than they ever had. The ink was fading, but the urgency carried through, especially in the final letter. It ended not with prayer or blessing, but with a plea. If something happens, please look to the corner, to the lamppost, to the men who do not belong here. When investigators compared the details in the letters to city maintenance records, something stood out immediately. According to official logs, no repairs were scheduled for that section of street in October of 90. The lamp had supposedly been replaced in June. The presence of workers at the crosswalk then should have been impossible. This discrepancy, coupled with the sidewalk discovery, gave the case its second fracture in the official story. Reporters who saw the letters were struck, not only by their content but by the intimacy of them. The way the twins signed off, sometimes together, sometimes individually, as though one had written the first half and the other had completed the thought. Their words carried the unmistakable sense of two young women, trying to convince themselves that their faith was strong enough to overcome their unease. Yet beneath the devotions and scripture quotations, fear curled like smoke. As the letters were read aloud on a local broadcast, older parishioners wept. They remembered the way the twins would hum hymns under their breath while walking home, the way they linked arms so tightly it was difficult to tell where one ended and the other began. To hear them speak from the past, warning of threats ignored, was a wound reopened. For the investigators, the letters were more than sentiment. They were evidence, physical, dated, and specific. Combined with the rosary beneath the sidewalk, they formed a chain of contradictions that could no longer be dismissed. The official narrative of two sisters who chose to leave was unraveling, one page at a time. The walk home that October night had always been described in vague terms. A simple half-mile route from the convent to the parish house where the twins sometimes stayed. But when investigators returned to the street in 2024, they set out to measure every step, to let the landscape itself testify. The sidewalk was patched and scarred with age, yet in places it still bore the same cracks and lines that would have been underfoot in 90. The investigators began at the convent gate, its iron hinges stiff but intact, and retraced the path as dusk settled, deliberately timing their steps to match the hour when the sisters would have left evening prayer 3 decades before. The neighborhood had changed. New houses. A gas station closed long ago, but there were still remnants of the past, the ones most people overlook. At the corner near St. Bridget's crosswalk, the air seemed to still carry a weight. One of the investigators pointed to the base of a lamppost, noting the difference in its foundation compared to the others. The concrete around it was smoother, younger, poured in a way that didn't match the records from the city archive. A local historian accompanying the team explained that lampposts, installed in the 1970s, had a distinctive metal collar. This one lacked it, replaced with a more modern seam. Whoever installed it had done so quietly, without leaving the proper paperwork behind. As they continued along the route, the silence of the street grew oppressive. Passing cars were rare, and the few pedestrians moved quickly, eyes averted from the investigators' notepads and cameras. A woman from a nearby porch finally spoke up. She had lived there in 1994 and remembered seeing flashing lights late one night around that corner. She never heard what it was about, only that by morning the sidewalk had been cordoned off briefly and then resealed. Her memory wavered, but she was certain of one thing. The smell of wet cement hung in the air when she walked to church the next morning. That detail struck the investigators hard. City records showed no such work order for that period, no reason for fresh cement to have been poured at all. Yet now, with the remains of the rosary unearthed beneath the sidewalk, the contradiction became impossible to dismiss. If the woman's recollection was correct, then someone poured concrete not to repair but to conceal. The street itself seemed to corroborate the story. Measuring tape revealed that one slab was slightly misaligned, its dimensions inconsistent with standard city guidelines. Hairline fractures spread outward in a way suggesting it was poured hastily, with less reinforcement than normal. Even the color of the aggregate was subtly different, a lighter gray, as if the mix had been rushed or sourced separately from other sidewalk sections. For a casual passerby, none of this would matter. But under the scrutiny of investigators, each discrepancy added to a mosaic of suspicion. Walking the route also revealed the vulnerability the sisters must have felt. From the convent to the parish, there were long stretches with no direct line of sight back to the chapel. Streetlights were sparse in the 90s, leaving pockets of darkness where any car could stop without notice. The investigators paused where the road narrowed, noting how easily a vehicle could have pulled alongside two women on foot, how quickly they could have been taken. Standing there in 2024, with the hum of distant traffic, it was not difficult to imagine the fear hinted at in the letters, eyes upon them, uniforms they did not trust. At the parish house, the investigators ended their walk by examining a weathered wooden door that had not changed since the 90s. Parish records confirmed that the twins never arrived that night. They had left the convent, but the parish house's door remained unopened. The walk had stopped somewhere in between, swallowed by the street. By the time the investigators returned to their vehicles, the sky was fully dark. They looked back at the corner where the misaligned lamppost stood, its light buzzing faintly above the cracked slab of sidewalk. It was an ordinary object to anyone else, yet to them, it marked the place where truth and lie intersected. The sidewalk that should have been a safe path home was instead a stage built to conceal. And now, 30 years later, it was beginning to betray its secrets. Inside the convent, the archives were not the only place where memory lingered. One of the surviving sisters, older now, frail but sharp in her recollection, guided investigators to a heavy ledger stored on a shelf behind the chapel. It was the community journal, a book meant to record the rhythm of convent life, prayers, feast days, weather, and occasionally notes of passing illness or small joys. The writing was communal, not private, and so it bore the collective voice of the order rather than the intimacy of a diary. Yet when the book was opened to the pages from October 1994, the investigators found something unexpected in the margins. Notations squeezed between lines of formal script, hurriedly scribbled in a different hand. The entry for October 16th had been neat, almost ceremonial. Feast of St. Margaret Mary Alacoque, candles lit at dusk. Sisters Margaret and Catherine completed evening. Prayers before leaving for the parish. The margins, however, told a different story. A faint scrawl angled along the side read, "They spoke with the officer again. He did not leave until long after the bell." The words were faint, almost erased, as though someone had tried to rub them out but left just enough of an imprint. Turning to the following day, the main entry recorded the absence of the twins. Sisters Margaret and Catherine did not return. Below that, in smaller handwriting squeezed beneath the lines, another note appeared. A car was waiting at the lamppost. Dark, not marked. The handwriting trailed off into what might have been the beginning of another sentence, then stopped abruptly as if the writer feared being caught. Forensic analysis later confirmed that the marginalia was written by one of the convent's older members who had since passed away. She was known at the time as quiet, meticulous, and deeply obedient. That she would dare to annotate the official journal at all suggested a powerful need to record what could not be spoken aloud. Her attempt at concealment, hiding, truth in the edges of routine became a kind of whispered testimony across the decades. The journal also included small doodles and shorthand marks, which investigators carefully photographed. One symbol repeated in the margins looked like a triangle with 3 dots, always placed near notes about the officer or the car. To outsiders, it seemed cryptic, but to those who knew convent life, it was the shorthand of someone afraid to write plainly. Some speculated the three dots might signify the twins, always together, always in twos, with a third looming presence watching them. Reading the journal aloud in the convent's dim library, investigators felt the claustrophobia of hindsight. The main body of the entries presented a facade of peace and piety, while the margins whispered of intrusion, threat, and dread. The sisters of the community had been instructed, in those years, to avoid scandal at all costs. To speak of harassment, to accuse men in uniform, was unthinkable. So instead, one woman had written into the borders of her sacred book, trusting that someday the margins might be noticed. The discovery of these notes aligned almost seamlessly with the letters uncovered earlier. Both referenced the uniformed man, both mentioned the lamppost, and both carried a tone of rising fear. What had once been easy to dismiss as paranoia now looked like a consistent pattern of warning signs ignored. Even more troubling was the suggestion that the convent itself had possessed knowledge, however partial, that something sinister had occurred on that October night. When news of the journal surfaced, the local diocese released a cautious statement, acknowledging the historical record but urging restraint in interpretation. They described the notes as ambiguous and not necessarily connected to the sisters' disappearance. But for the families and parishioners who had waited 30 years, the ambiguity felt deliberate. Another attempt to muffle voices that had already been silenced. The journal's margins became more than just scribbles. They were proof of a conscience trying to break through obedience, a small rebellion against forgetting. Holding the book in their hands, investigators understood they were not only reading evidence but hearing the echo of someone who had wanted the truth recorded, even if she lacked the power to say it aloud. The first living voice to step into the reopened case did so hesitantly, with the weight of 30 years pressing against his conscience. He was a retired city bus driver, a man in his 70s now, his hair gone white and his posture stooped, but his memory sharper than he wished it to be. For decades he had told himself that what he saw at the edge of St. Bridget's crosswalk might not have been what it seemed. He had let the official story wash over him like everyone else, convincing himself the twins had chosen to leave, that his eyes had misled him. But when the news of the rosary beneath the sidewalk hit the evening broadcast, he could no longer stay silent. He agreed to meet investigators at a diner on the outskirts of town, a place where no one from his old route would see him. The rain tapped against the windows as he nursed a black coffee, hands trembling slightly as he spoke. He explained that on the night of October 16, 1994, he had been driving the late shift, his route taking him down the quiet stretch where the convent met the parish. It was close to 9:30 p.m. when he saw two figures in habits walking together along the sidewalk. Their posture, arm in arm, was unmistakable. He had seen the twins many times before. They always drew a nod of recognition from passengers. As his bus slowed for the stoplight at the intersection, he noticed a dark sedan idling by the lamppost. There were no markings on the vehicle, no insignia, but the man leaning against it wore what appeared to be a police jacket. The sisters seemed to hesitate as they approached, their pace faltering. He remembered the man gesturing toward the car, remembered one of the nuns shaking her head, and then remembered the uniformed figure laughing and opening the rear door. What unsettled him most was the way the twins. By the time the light turned green, the sisters were at the car. One had stepped back. The other was being guided forward by the man's hand at her elbow. The driver admitted he nearly stopped, nearly opened the bus door to call out, but the moment passed too quickly. His passengers were restless. The schedule demanded he keep moving, and he told himself it was nothing unusual. When he glanced back through the rearview mirror, the sedan's taillights glowed red, and the sisters were no longer on the sidewalk. For years, he carried that scene like a splinter buried too deep to remove. When the news reported the disappearance, he had considered coming forward. But the very next day, he said, 2 men from the department boarded his bus during his shift and sat close behind him. They didn't accuse, didn't threaten outright. Instead, they spoke loudly enough for him to hear. How rumors could cost someone their job. How careless talk ruined reputations. He understood the message. He had a family to support, and silence seemed the safer choice. Now, 3 decades later, he was filled with regret. His voice cracked as he admitted to investigators that he had failed the twins. He described their faces in those final seconds. Confused, frightened and young in a way that still haunted him. The investigators listened without interruption, recording every word, knowing that his testimony aligned with the marginal notes in the journal and the letters left behind. The story he told was not without risk even now. When news outlets reported that a witness had come forward, the retired driver began receiving anonymous calls. Some were nothing more than heavy breathing, others a low voice warning him to stop stirring old ghosts. He refused to answer the phone after dark. Still, he told the investigators he would not retreat this time. "They were girls of faith," he said, eyes watering, "and I saw them taken. I can't go to my grave pretending otherwise." The weight of his account was immense. For the first time, the disappearance of the twin nuns was not just suggestion or artifact. It was anchored in living memory in the eyes of someone who had been there. His warning, veiled in silence for 30 years, finally entered the record, not only as evidence but as a reminder of the quiet pressures that had kept so many from speaking the truth. The search for answers moved from memory into the stubborn terrain of paperwork, where truth often hides behind stamped seals and typed lines. After the driver's testimony, investigators knew they had to test his story against the city's own. The city's Public Works Department produced a ledger of sidewalk repairs dating back decades. Each entry followed a familiar rhythm: project number, location, crew chief, completion date. When the investigators turned to October of 1994, they expected to see something about the block near St. Bridget's crosswalk, if only to justify the smooth, younger-looking concrete around the lamppost. But the pages were blank. That month's column jumped directly from an early September repair to a November job on the opposite side of town. According to the ledger, no work had been done in the area when the twins disappeared. That alone raised questions, but deeper digging unearthed more. In a dusty box marked photographic records, investigators found rolls of undeveloped negatives. After scanning them, one image caught their attention: a crew standing beside a mixer truck, at the very corner where the rosary had been found. Chalk markings on the curb in the frame clearly dated the picture, 10/17/94, the morning after the nuns vanished. On the wet surface of the fresh pour, someone had pressed a boot heel, leaving an impression that was captured in the photograph. The stamp in the corner of the image, belonging to the city's own engineering office, was indisputable. Yet when investigators compared this photograph to the official work orders, there was no matching entry. The stamped date on the photo, in the absence of paperwork, created a contradiction that could not be explained as clerical oversight. Someone had ordered a crew to pour fresh concrete without recording it, effectively erasing the act from the city's history. That erasure now looked deliberate. The strangeness deepened when a second discovery emerged: receipts for cement and aggregate billed to the city during that same week. The receipts bore the signature of a mid-level supervisor, but his name did not appear on any corresponding project logs. When interviewed, the man, now long retired, claimed he had no memory of a late-night pour at that location. His voice wavered when shown the photograph. "That shouldn't exist," he muttered, before refusing further questions. Forensic experts examined the actual sidewalk slab unearthed by the repair crew in 2024. They confirmed that the mixture was consistent with 1990s materials, but contained an unusual concentration of a particular stone aggregate not used in city projects after 1995. This detail tied the slab directly to that time frame. The investigators could now prove. When these findings leaked, city officials scrambled to explain. A spokesperson suggested the possibility of emergency repair work that hadn't been logged properly due to administrative error, but anyone familiar with municipal processes knew such errors might occur for a day, not for an entire job that required trucks, crews, and materials. The explanation rang hollow. To the families of the missing sisters, the stamped photo and the receipts were revelations. They weren't just artifacts. They were evidence that someone in authority had acted swiftly after the disappearance, sealing the ground where the sisters were last seen. For the community, it was a chilling thought that a crime scene had not only been mishandled but intentionally buried beneath layers of concrete and bureaucracy. The investigators laid the photo, receipts, and slab analysis side by side in their case room. Together, they painted a picture of concealment, orchestrated and precise. The rosary beneath the sidewalk was no accident, and neither was the silence of the records. The stamped date, once a routine mark of completion, now served as an indictment. It declared that the official story had been built on a foundation of lies, poured as deliberately as the concrete itself. As soon as the stamped photograph and the receipts surfaced, the tone of the investigation shifted. What had begun as a quiet reopening of a cold case now threatened to expose municipal negligence, or worse, deliberate cover-up. And institutions, when cornered, rarely remain silent. Within a week, the city scheduled a press conference. It was staged carefully inside the polished council chamber, flags positioned behind the podium, microphones lined like a firing squad. The police chief, flanked by the city attorney and two uniformed officers, spoke first. His words were clipped, rehearsed, and loaded with the authority of his office. We are aware of recently circulated claims suggesting irregularities in the handling of a tragic case from 1994. Let me state clearly, our department has found no evidence of wrongdoing, nor any indication that officers acted improperly at the time. Speculation is harmful to this community and to the memory of those involved. The statement was meant to soothe, but the defensiveness in his tone betrayed unease. Next, the city attorney dismissed the newly discovered records as inconclusive and taken out of context. He suggested the photograph might have been mislabeled, the receipts misplaced, the forensic analysis overstated. We urge the public not to confuse clerical inconsistencies with conspiracy, he said, eyes narrowed toward the cameras. The word conspiracy was intentional, designed to frame the investigators as fringe, not credible. Behind the podium, one of the officers shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tight as he scanned the crowd. The tension in the room was palpable. Reporters who had studied the case for years pressed harder than usual. One asked why. If the sisters had simply left of their own accord, as the police once insisted, their rosary had been found clutched in a hand beneath a sidewalk slab poured days after their disappearance. The chief sidestepped, claiming the remains had yet to be positively identified. Another reporter demanded to know why no emergency work order existed for the poor. The city attorney cut in quickly, repeating that errors happen and accusing the press of sensationalism. The backlash was not confined to the press conference. Behind closed doors, the lead investigators began receiving late-night calls from blocked numbers. Sometimes there was silence. Sometimes a low voice muttering, "You're stepping into things that don't concern you." One investigator returned to her car after a meeting to find all 4 tires slashed. Another noticed a sedan idling near his home for 3 nights in a row. None of this could be tied directly to the department, but the timing was impossible to ignore. At the same time, a quieter form of pressure arrived. Letters from the city threatening to cut funding for archival access, bureaucratic delays in retrieving records, sudden denials of previously promised interviews. Officials began hinting that the investigation was traumatizing the community, placing blame on the very people who were uncovering evidence. It was a textbook counter-narrative shift. Focus from the facts to the supposed harm of asking questions. Yet the counterattack only deepened public suspicion. Residents who had once been indifferent now filled town meetings, demanding to know why the city was so defensive. Parish members lit candles at the site of the discovery, creating a nightly vigil that drew quiet crowds. Local radio hosts replayed clips from the press conference, dissecting the evasive answers. Instead of quelling the story, the official pushback amplified it. The families of the twins, who had lived under the weight of silence for decades, spoke publicly for the first time in years. A niece of the sisters told reporters, "If the city has nothing to hide, then why are they trying so hard to shut everyone up?" Her words were raw, cutting through the sterile language of officials with the force of lived grief. The counter-narrative, once meant to restore control, was unraveling. By insisting on errors and coincidences, officials inadvertently confirmed that something had been hidden. Each denial, each bureaucratic delay, became another piece of circumstantial evidence pointing toward complicity. The truth, like water pressing against a cracked dam, was beginning to seep through, and the more they tried to contain it, the more unstoppable it became. The break came not from a file room or a reluctant witness, but from a box that should never have existed. A parishioner at St. Bridget's, an elderly man named Harold Connors, approached the investigators quietly after one of the nightly vigils. His hands trembled as he clutched a shoebox wrapped in twine. He said nothing at first, only pressed the box into their arms as though it burned to hold on to it any longer. "Found this when the sacristy was being cleared out years ago," he whispered. Didn't think it mattered. Now I think it does. Inside were items that smelled faintly of mildew and incense, folded hymn sheets, a torn bulletin, and at the bottom, a small plastic cassette tape in a cracked case. Someone had scrawled the words Tuesday night, 10:11 on its label in blue ink. That was the night the twins disappeared. The air seemed to tighten around the investigators as they realized what they were holding. They had the tape transferred carefully, wary of degrading the fragile ribbon. When the sound engineer pressed play, the hiss of static filled the room, then a faint click of a handheld recorder being set down. What followed was not a sermon or rehearsal, as they first expected, but hurried voices, two women speaking, their cadence unmistakable, Sister Anne and Sister Margaret, the twins. They sounded tense, whispering as if afraid of being overheard. The recording began mid-conversation. "We can't keep quiet anymore," one said. "They'll say it's disobedience," the other answered quickly. "It's not disobedience if it's the truth." There was the rustle of fabric, perhaps their habits brushing together, and the low hum of traffic outside the convent. Then a third sound intruded, footsteps approaching, heavy, deliberate. The voices of the sisters faltered, their whispers turning urgent. One said, "Hide this, please, just in case." The tape cut off in a burst of static. The room where the investigators listened fell into silence, the gravity of the artifact settling over them. Here was direct evidence that the sisters had been worried, frightened, and planning to speak out about something just hours before they vanished. The cassette was not just a clue, it was their own voices, carried across 30 years. An echo of intent that had been interrupted. Forensic analysts examined the tape's casing. Dust and wax residue suggested it had been stored in a church candle drawer for years. The handwriting on the label matched known samples of Sister Margaret's script. The date aligned exactly with the timeline of the disappearance. It was authentic. The discovery of the tape reframed everything. No longer could the disappearance be explained as two nuns who wandered off or joined a cloister in secret, as some had once whispered. The cassette revealed motive. They had known something dangerous enough to silence them, and they had tried, in their own limited way, to leave behind proof. When word of the tape leaked, the city moved quickly again. Officials cast doubt, suggesting the audio could have been fabricated or misdated. They insisted no context existed for the conversation, that it was irresponsible to read meaning into fragmentary words. But those who heard the recording felt the weight of its authenticity in their bones, the hesitation in the sisters' voices, the nervous urgency, the abrupt silence. These were not details of fabrication, could conjure with such precision. Among the community, the cassette became almost sacred. Copies circulated quietly, played in kitchens late at night, passed from hand to hand like contraband truth. Parishioners described it as if the sisters had reached across time, refusing to be erased. For the families, it was devastating and galvanizing at once. Their loved ones had been trying to warn the world. Someone had stopped them. The investigators cataloged the tape as Artifact 1 in their case log. They placed it in a fireproof safe alongside the rosary and the stamped photograph. Each item seemed to belong to a growing archive of resistance, against an official story that no longer held together. The sisters had spoken, however briefly, and their words were a call to press deeper into the silence that surrounded the night of October 11th, 1994. The cassette changed everything. Until then, the case had lived in the liminal space between rumor and record, where speculation could be dismissed as memory playing tricks. But hearing the sisters' voices, urgent, frightened, unfinished, was different. It was no longer the investigators' theory. It was the twins themselves, preserved in sound, contradicting every official reassurance that their disappearance had been voluntary or benign, and the town could not unhear it. At first the tape spread quietly. A burned CD here, a file shared on a flash drive there, whispered about in parish halls and kitchen gatherings. But soon the local radio host, already skeptical of the city's statements, played a 30-second excerpt during a late-night broadcast. Listeners pulled over on rural roads to turn up their dials, hearts pounding at the trembling voices of Sister Anne and Sister Margaret. Within a day, the clip was everywhere, copied onto phones, uploaded to online forums, dissected on conspiracy podcasts. The effect on the town was immediate and polarizing. For some, the tape confirmed long-held suspicions that the church and city officials had conspired to bury the truth. "They knew something," said one parishioner in an interview, her voice breaking. And instead of protecting them, someone silenced them. Others resisted. Some parish leaders called the tape a distraction, warning the faithful not to succumb to gossip. Retired priests suggested the voices could have been taken out of context, merely two women worried about internal disputes, not corruption or danger. Loyal congregants repeated his words, clinging to the idea that nothing so sinister could happen in their quiet town. To admit otherwise was to accept that their own leaders, their protectors, might have been complicit in violence. The fracture deepened when an emergency town hall meeting was called. Hundreds packed the high school gym, the air thick with sweat and tension. Investigators sat in the back as residents lined up at microphones. One woman demanded to know why the church had never disclosed the tape. A man shouted that city officials were covering up a crime. A handful defended the institutions, accusing the investigators of exploiting grief for notoriety. Shouts overlapped, and the meeting ended with more questions than answers, but also with a visible shift. The old trust in authority had cracked wide open. Outside the hall, clusters of neighbors whispered fiercely. Some swapped theories about construction crews paid off under the table, about something darker hidden under the convent's foundations. Others spoke of fear. If they could make two nuns disappear, one man said, what else could they do to keep us quiet? The church itself felt the shock. Attendance at Mass dipped sharply. Pews half empty on Sundays for the first time in memory. Parish donations faltered, and while some priests remained steadfast, others avoided eye contact, their sermons thinner, their homilies defensive. A few whispered privately to investigators off the record that the sisters had been preparing to report financial irregularities or inappropriate behavior from those in power. None dared to sign a statement. City officials, meanwhile, doubled down. A stern letter circulated, warning residents against sharing unverified recordings that could inflame division. But the more they tried to smother it, the more it spread. The tape had become a living presence in the town, an artifact people replayed to feel closer to the truth. It wasn't just evidence anymore. It was a memorial, a haunting reminder that the sisters had spoken and had not been heard in their time. The investigators documented the community's reaction carefully, recognizing its significance. Public trust was collapsing, and with it, the shield that had long protected those in power. The sisters' absence was no longer an old wound endured in silence. It was a fresh cut bleeding in the open. And in that opening, pressure for real answers began to mount. The real turning point came not from the tape alone, but from what followed in its wake. Once the sisters' voices were heard, townspeople who had stayed silent for decades began to revisit memories they had once dismissed or suppressed. It was one such recollection, seemingly small, that led investigators to the convent basement, a place long sealed and ignored since the parish had downsized in the late 1990s. The tip came from a former altar boy, now middle-aged, who recalled carrying boxes of hymnals downstairs 1 week after the sisters vanished. He remembered a peculiar moment. A visiting work crew was already in the basement, though no repairs had been scheduled. They were hauling crates and sealing off a storage room with new plaster. They told me to leave, he said. Said it was unsafe. But I always wondered what was really behind that wall. Armed with this detail, the investigators requested access to the convent basement. The parish, already under scrutiny, reluctantly agreed. The door was heavy, its hinges rusted, the air inside thick with mold and dust. The faint smell of damp earth lingered beneath the old stone arches. Flashlights cut through the gloom, beams catching on stacked chairs, discarded statues and hymnals warped by moisture. But at the far end, where the altar boy had described, a wall of plaster stood out, smoother, newer than the surrounding masonry. A structural engineer confirmed their suspicion. The wall had been added hastily, without proper reinforcement. With permission granted, a small demolition team chipped away at the plaster. The sound of hammers echoed through the cavernous basement. Dust billowed as chunks fell, revealing a hollow cavity just wide enough to conceal a trunk-sized space. Within, shrouded in cobwebs and grime, sat a wooden chest bound by tarnished brass hinges. The chest was locked, but its age had weakened it. A crowbar pried it open with a crack that sounded almost alive. Inside lay a cache of artifacts, papers, notebooks, and several sealed envelopes tied with ribbon. On top rested a thin leather journal, its cover scarred but intact. The first page bore the inscription, "For whoever needs to understand, Sister Anne." The journal was a mixture of daily notes and fragments of confession. Pages described irregularities in parish finances, unexplained withdrawals from accounts meant for community relief, and late-night deliveries to the rectory. More alarming were entries hinting at pressure from both church and civic leaders. "We are asked to turn our eyes away," one line read. "But to be silent is to consent. Margaret says we must speak," another, written in a hurried hand. Just alongside the journal were photographs, grainy, Polaroids showing construction equipment parked near the convent. Timestamps scribbled on the white margins that matched the week of the sisters' disappearance. In one image, a cement truck stood beside the very lamppost where the rosary had later been found. There were also audio cassettes, unmarked, and a bundle of parish letters with entire paragraphs redacted in black ink. At the bottom of the chest, wrapped in cloth, lay a small key. Its purpose was unknown, though its deliberate preservation suggested importance. The investigators cataloged everything, photographing the items before carefully sealing them into evidence bags. For them, the discovery was more than a breakthrough. It was a voice reaching across 30 years. The sisters had hidden these materials intentionally, as if they knew the danger was imminent and wanted to leave behind a trail someone might one day uncover. When word of the chest spread, the town erupted again. The vigil outside grew into a permanent encampment of tents and banners. Protesters called for resignations, for criminal inquiries, for the excavation of every hidden corner of the city. Officials, scrambling to regain control, declared the journal inconclusive and insisted the photographs lacked authentication, but their denials no longer carried weight. The artifacts themselves carried the truth in their physicality: ink on pages, dust in corners, tape hisses that could not be manufactured retroactively. The cache was christened by locals as the Sisters' Archive, and for the investigators, it was the missing piece that transformed rumor into record. The hidden chest revealed intent, context, and most importantly, forewarning. Anne and Margaret had been silenced not by accident, but because they were about to expose something someone desperately wanted buried. The cache of artifacts changed the tone of the entire investigation. What had been whispers, shadows, and speculation was suddenly tangible, undeniable, weighty enough to rattle the city itself. But the discovery also triggered the most dangerous phase of the inquiry, when those who had something to lose realized the walls were closing in. The investigators had long suspected that the concrete slab where the rosary had been found was only part of a larger burial of evidence. Now, with the journal entries and Polaroids showing heavy machinery near the convent, pressure mounted to excavate beneath the site itself. It took weeks of wrangling, petitions and legal maneuvers. But finally, under public pressure, the city reluctantly authorized a limited dig at the spot where the rosary had surfaced. The announcement drew national attention. News vans lined the street, reporters clustered behind barricades, and residents gathered at dawn to watch. The excavation team began by cordoning off the sidewalk and cutting deep into the concrete slab. The steady grind of saws and jackhammers filled the air, drowning out the murmured prayers of parishioners clutching candles. Across the street, as the machines peeled away the layers, a hush fell over the crowd. Beneath the first pour of concrete, the soil appeared unnaturally disturbed, darker and looser than surrounding earth. Then, as shovels broke through the compacted dirt, something metallic clinked. The workers paused, brushing carefully until a rusted latch appeared. It was the edge of a small iron container, buried less than 3 feet below the surface. The crowd pressed forward as the team wrestled it free, raising a dirt-streaked box about the size of a footlocker. On its lid, faint beneath rust and corrosion, were stenciled letters barely visible. Property of Public Works Department, 1994. The discovery set off an immediate frenzy. Cameras zoomed in, reporters shouted questions, and police tried to push the crowd back. The box was carried under tight guard to a temporary tent erected nearby. The investigators, wearing gloves, forced the corroded latch open. Inside was a jumble of items, stained cloths, scraps of paperwork sealed in plastic sleeves, and at the very bottom, 2 small objects that froze everyone in the tent: a pair of identical rosaries, their beads tangled together. The reaction outside was instant and volcanic. Rumors spread faster than official statements could contain. Some swore they had seen human bone fragments in the box, though officials refused to confirm it. Others claimed the rosaries had been deliberately placed as a kind of marker, a cruel token buried alongside paperwork meant to vanish. Whatever the truth, the dig site had transformed into a theater of reckoning. That evening, under floodlights and live television coverage, the excavation continued. Search dogs were brought in, pawing and whining at a particular patch near the lamppost. For hours, the crowd held its breath as crews dug deeper, the hum of machinery interrupted only by shouted orders. Just before midnight, the diggers uncovered what appeared to be the corner of a wooden beam, out of place in the soil. Slowly, methodically, the team exposed it. It was part of a collapsed wooden crate, long buried and water damaged, containing bundles of papers wrapped in oilcloth. The papers, when briefly examined under light, bore city seals and typed dates. October 994. They looked like original work orders, permits, and inspection reports that should have been stored in the municipal archive. The fact that they were here, entombed beneath a sidewalk, confirmed the unthinkable. Someone had deliberately removed and buried official documents to erase the trail. As the crates and the iron box were hauled away under police escort, chaos erupted outside the barriers. Residents chanted, reporters demanded access, and priests attempted to calm the crowd with calls for prayer. Yet the atmosphere was more riot than vigil. The raw anger of a community realizing their history had been rewritten in cement and silence. For the investigators, it was the most dangerous moment yet. As they transported the evidence, unmarked cars tailed them through the night. At one point, a black SUV attempted to cut them off, forcing them onto a side street before disappearing into the darkness. It was a reminder. Someone was still watching, still willing to intimidate, still desperate to stop the truth from surfacing. By dawn, the excavation site was cordoned off, police standing shoulder to shoulder around the pit as though guarding a crime scene that spanned 3 decades. The set piece had played out. Earth broken, secrets unearthed. The story too public now to ever return to silence. Yet beneath the adrenaline, a darker realization settled in. The excavation had not yet revealed everything. The sisters had hinted in their journal that what they knew went deeper than finances or irregularities. The soil had given up its first secrets, but it was clear the ground still held more. The excavation was supposed to be the end of it, the moment officials could claim they had allowed the process, checked the boxes, and moved on. But once the iron box and oilcloth bundles were pried from the soil, the story no longer belonged to City Hall or the parish. It belonged to the cameras, to the voices shouting outside the barricades, and to a public that had lost its patience with silence. By morning, the images were everywhere. The rusted latch, the stained rosaries, the mud-caked papers lifted under floodlight. What had once been whispered rumors had now become front-page news. Local outlets were quickly overwhelmed by national reporters. Satellite vans lined Main Street, their dishes pointed skyward, cables snaking over sidewalks, anchors broadcast live from the church steps. Speaking of a decades-old mystery that has shaken the foundations of a town, and perhaps its institutions, every network framed the story differently. Some focused on the sisters' faith and sacrifice, others on the suggestion of corruption and cover-up. But all of them agreed on one point. The official story had collapsed. The city council, scrambling to contain the outrage, convened an emergency session. It was televised, an unprecedented step meant to show transparency. The chamber was packed with residents, their faces tight with suspicion. Officials sat stiff in their suits, the mayor grim as he read a statement, acknowledging the excavation, but insisting. When public comment opened, the chamber erupted. A former parish volunteer demanded to know why the journals had been hidden. A mother of 3 shouted that her children had been raised to trust the church, only to find that the very institution might have conspired in silence. The council president banged his gavel repeatedly, but the voices would not stop. The meeting devolved into chaos, chants rising. "Tell the truth! Tell the truth!" echoing off marble walls that had once felt untouchable. The fallout extended far beyond the chamber. Within days, a petition circulated online demanding a state-level inquiry. Over 30,000 signatures were gathered in less than a week. State representatives, sensing political peril, began making statements of grave concern and calling for the release of all parish and city records from the 1990s. Even the governor, careful with his words, admitted the findings were troubling and worthy of further scrutiny. At the parish, the consequences were immediate and painful. Attendance plummeted further, donations nearly ceased, and a group of parishioners staged a sit-in, refusing to leave until the diocese addressed the allegations. The bishop, appearing in a somber televised address, spoke of misunderstandings and tragedy compounded by rumor, but his attempt at reassurance only fueled suspicion. His refusal to mention the cassette or the journal by name made it clear to many that the church's priority remained control, not truth. For the families of the twins, the attention was both vindicating and agonizing. Cameras followed them as they walked into council hearings, microphones pushed into their faces as they left their homes. They had wanted answers, but they had never asked to become symbols. One niece of the sisters broke down during an interview, saying, "We just want to bring them home. We don't care about politics. We just want the truth." Her tears aired on evening broadcasts nationwide, a reminder that beyond the documents and artifacts lay real lives still broken open. Meanwhile, the investigators found themselves at the center of a storm. Their phones buzzed constantly, press inquiries, angry officials, anonymous threats. They were called heroes by some, agitators by others. But the artifacts spoke louder than opinion. The oilcloth-wrapped papers, once catalogued, revealed inconsistencies between recorded dates and public events. One inspection report listed October 14, 1994, as a completion date for a sidewalk, section 3 full days, after the sisters disappeared, yet stamped with an official's name who had already been retired by then. The contradiction was too glaring to dismiss. This revelation made its way into a televised panel discussion, where former city employees were asked to weigh in. One retired clerk admitted live on air that he had seen files go missing in those days, but had been too afraid to speak. The admission sent shockwaves across the broadcast, sparking headlines the next morning, "Fear and Silence in St. Bridget's." The public sphere had become a battleground. On one side stood institutions wielding polished statements, insisting on caution and patience. On the other stood a growing movement of citizens, families and outsiders demanding exposure, fueled by the physical artifacts unearthed from beneath their feet. Each press conference, each hearing, each leak of a document widened the rift. By the end of that week, the question was no longer whether something had been hidden in 1994. It was how far the concealment reached, and how many hands had been involved in keeping it buried for 3 decades. The wave of public exposure brought momentum, but with it came a shadow that fell directly over the investigators themselves. For months they had been the ones piecing together fragments of evidence, quietly building a case that institutions insisted did not exist. Now, with the excavation and the hearings thrusting them into the spotlight, they had become visible targets. The pressure was no longer abstract. It was personal, sharp, and immediate. It began with the phone calls. At first, they were nothing more than hang-ups at odd hours, the faint sound of breathing on the other end. Then came the messages. A male voice, low and unhurried, began leaving warnings. "You're in over your head," he said once. "Walk away before someone has to bury you too," he said another night. The investigators reported the threats, but the calls were always routed through blocked numbers, bouncing off towers in ways that made tracing them nearly impossible. The pressure extended into their daily lives. One evening, as one of the lead investigators left her office, she noticed her car door slightly ajar. Nothing was stolen, but the glove compartment had been rifled through, papers scattered. The intrusion was deliberate, not a theft, but a message. "We can reach you whenever we want." Another investigator returned home to find his mailbox stuffed with copies of his own notes, photocopied and marked with red slashes through key passages. He sat in his kitchen that night, staring at the pile, feeling for the first time the true weight of being watched. Their families, too, began to feel the strain. One investigator's teenage daughter received anonymous texts warning her to tell your dad to stop. Another's spouse found a dead bird left neatly on their porch, its wings spread as if arranged. The symbolism was unmistakable: silence or else. These moments cracked open the thin armor of professional detachment they had tried to maintain. Behind closed doors, they admitted to each other the fear they carried, fear not just of failing the sisters, but of losing everything else in the process. Yet fear was not the only force at play. There were moments of intimacy, of raw honesty, that deepened their resolve. One late night, sitting in a cramped motel room after a hearing in the Capitol, 2 investigators spread the sisters' journal across the bed between them. The pages smelled faintly of mildew, ink smudged from the sisters' hurried hands. They read aloud the words, We are warned, but we cannot remain silent. Truth is louder than fear. The line landed heavily. In the dim glow of a desk lamp, one investigator admitted quietly, "I think they knew this would cost them their lives. And they did it anyway." The silence after that admission was long and aching. For a moment, the work shifted from procedural to deeply personal. It was no longer about winning against the city or the church. It was about honoring two women who had chosen conscience over safety and paying the price. The investigators realized they were now walking a similar path, not nuns bound by vows, but still bound by duty to the truth. Despite their resolve, exhaustion began to seep in. Sleep was fractured, haunted by the images of the excavation and the hiss of the cassette. Meals were skipped. Arguments flared in whispered tones. Was it worth it? Could they even win against forces this entrenched? One argued they should hand the cash to state authorities and step back. Another countered, "Do you trust the state not to bury it again?" That question hung heavy, because none of them could answer honestly in the affirmative. The personal toll became most visible in their isolation. Former allies distanced themselves, afraid of being dragged into the storm. Old friends stopped calling. Even some of the parishioners, who had first encouraged them now, whispered that the investigators were bringing too much heat. It was a lonely battle, the kind where resolve had to be renewed daily, one tired breath at a time. But for all the fear, the threats, and the isolation, there was also clarity. The investigators could feel that the truth was closer than ever, pressed against the surface of the narrative like something waiting to break through. The personal cost was undeniable, but the cost of walking away would be worse. Every artifact they held, the rosary. It was nearly midnight when the investigators returned to the parish archive, a cramped annex that smelled of dust and mold, with rows of filing cabinets and forgotten boxes stacked like tombstones. They had been warned against returning without official clearance, but the threats had made clearance meaningless. If anything, the harassment had sharpened their focus. They knew the most fragile evidence was often left behind, overlooked by those more concerned with appearances than truth. And so, armed with flashlights and gloves, they began combing through the clutter once more. What they found was not in a drawer or cabinet, but in the hollow beneath a warped floorboard at the back of the room. One investigator, leaning against the wall to stretch his aching back, felt the board give slightly under his heel. A quick inspection revealed the wood had been pried up before, then hammered back in place. With careful pressure, they lifted it free, revealing a shallow cavity lined with dust and cobwebs. Inside was a bundle no larger than a shoebox, wrapped in wax paper that had yellowed and cracked over time. When unwrapped, the contents were heartbreakingly intimate. At the top of the bundle was a stack of Polaroid photographs, their edges curled. They showed the sisters in candid, everyday moments, hanging laundry in the convent yard, walking arm in arm down a tree-lined street, kneeling together in prayer. The images were simple, almost mundane, but they carried a weight heavier than any official document. Here were the sisters as people, not symbols, not mysteries, captured in the small gestures of ordinary life. Beneath the photos lay a series of letters written in a delicate but urgent hand. They were addressed to no one in particular, as if the sisters had written them for posterity, for anyone who might one day find them. In one letter, dated September 1994, the twins described a growing sense of danger. "We are followed when we walk home at night," one wrote. "We see the same car waiting near the corner. They think we do not notice, but we do. We cannot tell if it is meant to scare us or to remind us that someone is always watching." Another letter was even more haunting. It spoke of a parish official urging them to remain quiet about financial irregularities they had witnessed. Money missing from charity funds, donations diverted to accounts no one could trace. The sisters admitted to feeling conflicted, torn between their vow of obedience and their conscience. "We have prayed for clarity, but silence feels like complicity," the letter read. "If something should happen to us, let it be known that we tried to tell the truth." The final item in the bundle was a small leather-bound notebook, its cover cracked and stained. Inside were notes written in both sisters' handwriting, alternating between voices. Some entries detailed schedules and daily tasks, but others were deeply personal reflections, worries about their safety, doubts about the integrity of the church they had devoted their lives to, hopes that their small acts of defiance might matter. One entry stood out: "If the world ever learns our story, let them know we were not afraid to walk together, even into the dark. The weight of the discovery was overwhelming. The investigators sat in silence, the hum of the old building the only sound around them. The photographs and letters shifted, the case from shadowy suspicion to flesh and blood. This was not just about hidden reports or buried artifacts. It was about two women who had foreseen their own fate and tried to leave a trail for others to follow. But the letters also posed new questions. Who was the official who had pressured them? What financial irregularities had they uncovered? And how deep did that corruption run? The sisters had been careful, never naming names directly, as though even in writing they feared retribution. That fear seemed to seep off the pages, wrapping around the investigators as they read by flashlight. When they finally rewrapped the bundle, they did so with reverence as though handling relics. These artifacts were more than evidence. They were voices speaking across 30 years, preserved by chance and determination, and yet the danger was clear. Whoever had gone to such lengths to silence the sisters might still be watching, still determined to keep these truths from reaching the public. The investigators carried the bundle out of the archive with a new solemnity, aware that they now bore not only evidence but the burden of the sisters' final words. The pressure had been building for weeks, and by the time the investigators decided to step forward with the bundle of photographs and letters, there was no way to keep the act quiet. Too many people already knew the case had shifted. Too many rumors about a second cache were spilling out in fragments online. The moment demanded more than a whisper. It demanded spectacle. And so the reveal was staged not in a backroom meeting or a quiet press release, but in front of cameras, under the sharp white light of a state house hearing room packed with reporters, officials, and ordinary citizens who had waited 3 decades for clarity. The investigators knew the risks. They had received warnings, some veiled, others blunt. "Stay quiet or you won't leave alive," one voicemail had hissed. Their cars had been followed, their families watched. But fear was a currency already spent. They had reached the point where silence felt more dangerous than exposure. Carrying the weathered bundle, wrapped again in its cracked wax paper, they entered the chamber to a storm of flashbulbs and murmurs that surged like a rising tide. The officials presiding over the hearing were tense, caught between the need for order and the knowledge that order had already fractured. The mayor sat stone-faced, the bishop flanked by aides in dark suits. A state representative leaned forward, clearly calculating what political survival demanded of him. And at the witness table sat the investigators, their microphones live, the cameras rolling. When the bundle was unwrapped and the photographs laid out one by one across the table, the room fell into an eerie silence. The images were projected onto a screen behind them. The twins hanging laundry, walking arm in arm, kneeling in prayer. Ordinary snapshots, but in their ordinariness lay the proof of their humanity, stripped from them by decades of rumors and institutional denial. Faces in the gallery softened. Some wept openly. Then came the letters. One investigator read aloud, voice steady but taut, the September 1994 note about being followed. The words seemed to echo in the chamber, heavy and unavoidable. Gasps rippled through the crowd when the second letter described financial irregularities, funds siphoned from charity accounts. The names were absent, but the implication was clear. Corruption at the heart of the parish, and perhaps beyond. The bishop shifted in his seat, his hands clasping and unclasping nervously. When pressed by a representative, he leaned into practiced rhetoric. Letters such as these may reflect paranoia or misunderstanding. We must be cautious not to assign blame without proof. But his words faltered against the sight of the sisters' handwriting, their warnings preserved across 3 decades of silence. The tension broke when a voice from the gallery shouted, "You let them die!" Others joined, a rising chorus of anger and grief. The officials pounded their gavels, ordered silence, but the chant swelled until the hearing room shook with it. For a moment, it seemed as if the session might collapse into chaos. Security moved nervously along the aisles, but the investigators remained calm, their eyes fixed on the photographs spread before them. Then, in a move neither side had anticipated, one of the investigators slid forward the leather-bound notebook. Its cracked cover and handwritten pages were angled toward the cameras. Without speaking, they flipped to the entry that read, "If the world ever learns our story, let them know we were not afraid to walk together, even into the dark." The words were captured live, broadcast in real time to households across the country. That moment became the set piece, the crystallizing image of the case. Not the excavation, not the threats, not even the contradictions in the records. It was the sight of two women's words, written 30 years before, finally breaking into the light where no official could smother them. The official statements paled, their authority shrinking before the raw power of a testimony too human to deny. When the session ended, it was clear the balance had shifted. No longer was this just an investigation or a local mystery. It had become a public reckoning. The chants followed the officials out of the chamber, spilling into the streets where protesters had gathered. Candles were lit on the steps, photographs of the twins held aloft. Reporters swarmed, their voices describing a turning point and evidence of systemic rot. The investigators left the building exhausted, knowing the risks had multiplied. By making the reveal so public, they had ensured the story could not be buried again. But they had also made themselves targets in a way they had never been before. Still, as they stepped into the cool night air, hearing the chants echo from the crowd, they felt something stir, a fragile sense of justice, finally beginning to surface. The town moved differently in the weeks after the hearing. It was not a swift or clean transformation, but a slow, uneven reckoning. Flowers began appearing on the church steps, first in small bundles left by elderly parishioners with trembling hands, then in sweeping displays from younger generations who had grown up hearing whispers of the vanished nuns but never knowing their names. Candles burned in rows, their wax dripping down in uneven rivers, the flames flickering in the autumn wind as though reluctant to extinguish. The faces of the sisters, once just grainy, photographs in missing person. Posters were now reprinted on banners, flyers, even murals on brick walls. They were no longer absent figures. They had been restored to the town's collective memory, not as symbols of silence, but as witnesses who had spoken when it mattered most. The investigators attended a memorial service at the parish where the twins had once served. The air inside the chapel was heavy, filled with incense and the low murmur of prayer. The pews were crowded, yet there was no sense of unity, only tension, grief, and fragile attempts at forgiveness. The bishop presided, his voice measured, but his authority hollowed out. His words about sacrifice and mystery rang false against the hard evidence the public had already seen. What resonated instead were the voices of ordinary townspeople who stood to speak. One woman, her voice cracking, told how the sisters had secretly delivered food to her family when they could not afford groceries. A man spoke of how the twins had taught him to read as a boy, their patience shaping his future. The stories flowed like water from a cracked dam, each one painting the sisters not as victims but as women of immense courage and compassion. The investigators sat quietly, listening, their minds still restless with unanswered questions. The artifacts had revealed much, but not everything. Who had followed the sisters in the weeks before their disappearance? Whose name should have been on the siphoned accounts? Which official had ordered the cover-up? And why had the silence been guarded for 30 years? Some of those answers might still lie, hidden in files or in the minds of those too, afraid to speak. But the sisters' voices had broken through, and that was a beginning. After the service, a vigil was held outside, the crowd spilling into the streets. Children clutched candles, their small faces glowing in the light. A choir of parish volunteers sang softly, the sound carrying down the block. It was somber, but also defiant, a quiet refusal to let the sisters' story vanish again. For the investigators, it was a moment of bittersweet release. They had not solved everything. They had not named every guilty hand, but they had restored something essential, the truth that two women had tried to leave behind. Later that night, as the investigators packed away their files, one of them sorted through the sisters' notebook one last time. The pages were fragile, the ink fading in places, but at the back of the book, tucked behind the cover, was something no one had noticed before, a scrap of paper folded tightly, pressed so flat it nearly blended with the binding. When unfolded, it revealed only a few lines, written in hurried, uneven script. If we do not return, look to Ravenwood. The rest is there. The name jolted them. Ravenwood. A word that carried no immediate meaning, but hung in the air with a sense of place, of direction, of something unfinished. It was not closure. It was an open door. Whatever Ravenwood was, it was where the threads of this story might lead next. The investigators exchanged glances. There was relief in what they had accomplished, but also the recognition that the sisters had left them not just with answers, but with a map toward deeper truths. They closed the notebook carefully, the weight of the word lingering. Outside, the vigil burned on, the crowd chanting softly, "Never forgotten." The night was quiet, but in that quiet lay the hum of something larger, something that refused to stay buried. The case of the vanished twins had reached its end in one sense. A community restored, a silence broken, a truth carried into light. Yet with Ravenwood now etched into their path, the story did not feel like an ending at all. It felt like a beginning disguised as closure, the soft opening of another chapter waiting in the dark.